Madam Chair, in my opening speech I said that developing the Singaporean core in the workforce requires a multi-pronged approach. One important aspect of this approach is to take a firm stand against discriminatory practices. I would like to thank, firstly, I think many of you out there who have written in, to me personally and to my ministry and to actually many of my colleagues to share your insights, observations, and actually many very thoughtful suggestions about how we should deal with the issue of fair employment practices. In particular, I also want to recognize the work of my colleagues, Ms. Fumiha, Mr. Patrick Tay, and Mr. Liang Eng Hua, who have been actually actively championing these concerns and having been long conversations with me on what the concerns are out there and what we should do about it. So today, I would really like to squarely deal with the concerns that Singaporeans have on nationality discrimination and the impact of foreign labor on their jobs. Well, let's start from a sense-making perspective. I've been tracking this, gathering feedback, and also looking at possible solutions. I first spoke about nationality discrimination about a year and a half ago. We started studying how other countries dealt with hiring practices. We began analyzing and investigating the range of complaints that we received. And we also started adjusting our employment pass framework, in fact last year in January 2012, as the first step towards leveling the playing field. We will do more, and I will explain how we will address the concerns systematically. Let me first describe the issue at hand. Singaporeans understand, I think from the many emails I've received, many of the conversations, it's quite clear that actually Singaporeans understand that actually we do need to be open to the world. Our survival, our very existence depends on it. As a people, we are warm, open-hearted, welcoming. That is who we are. Our people also recognize that we need foreign labor at various levels. They do recognize that tapping on to the global pool of talent and manpower benefits us because it actually creates good jobs and opportunities for Singaporeans. It allows us to be competitive and to strengthen Singapore itself. But the main concern that Singaporeans have is whether we have enough safeguards for our people. Meaning that even as we recognize the benefits, we understand that we have concerns about whether the safeguards are in place. Mr. Yogurt Kwang, Dr. Chia Shi Lu, Engineer Lee Bee Wah, and Mr. Gan Tian Po have voiced concerns over whether our work pass framework allows Singaporeans to compete fairly with foreign professionals for good PMAT jobs, particularly at the EP level. They have also made good suggestions on how we can level the playing field further, on how we can ensure that Singaporeans are not overlooked or worse still, discriminated against in our own workplaces. We have Singaporeans informing us that the governments of other countries have stricter policies about hiring foreigners. But we must remember that we are in Singapore actually creating more jobs than there are Singaporeans to fill them. The situation in other countries is exactly the reverse. As I highlighted earlier, our unemployment is actually fairly low at 3%. PME unemployment is actually even lower than that. But be that as it may, to those who are unemployed, to those who are displaced, it doesn't matter that it's 3%, it doesn't matter it's 2%. As far as the individual is concerned, it is 100%. So let me try to organize a sense of frustration that we sense out there into three categories. First, the hiring their own kind, or the unfair hiring practices. We have heard anecdotes of how in certain cases, heads of business units or HR managers have a preference for candidates they are familiar with, or of the same nationality, for reasons that are irrelevant to job performance and irrespective of whether they are more competent than other candidates. We have also heard of situations where Singaporeans were retrenched or made to resign in the name of downsizing, only to realize later that their positions were given to foreigners who were, coincidentally, from the same countries as their business heads. So let me be quite blunt. Would these practices not sound discriminatory? Would any respectable, progressive company endorse these practices? If this hiring is indeed because they care only about choosing familiar candidates and not about hiring the best man for the job, then I'll say that such practices have no place in Singapore's workplaces. Discrimination will not and cannot be tolerated. But I'll say this, stating this principle does not mean that it is easy to implement. I think we all recognize that proving discrimination is sometimes difficult. It is not always possible to discern whether such hiring practices are legitimately based on the objective requirements of the job or motivated by personal connections. And we all know how Kwanzi works as well. But I know that Singaporeans perceive some outcomes to be against the principles of meritocracy and fairness, and I fully understand why we feel angry in the process. Second, business heads or HR managers may not be paying enough attention to local talent. In the name of efficiency, or sometimes meritocracy, some managers will want an employee in as fast as possible, whether Singapore or foreign. So it may therefore be more expedient for them to rely on recommendations from others or ready stock of foreign candidates supplied by headhunters. In fact, one CEO we met told us that it was simply more convenient for him to mount an overseas recruitment exercise in a particular country to get all the skilled manpower he needs than to invest in a detailed and time-consuming recruitment search for potential candidates within the local job market. Third, qualified foreign candidates who come in at lower level employment passes and even at S-Pass compete directly with our fresh university and diploma graduates and mid-level PME Singaporeans. So in some cases, firms may prefer the foreign candidate following a purely merit-based assessment, as he may be as qualified, but perhaps willing to work for a lower wage compared to a Singaporean. Such foreign candidates could include talented graduates from developed countries looking for better opportunities in Asia. Is this meritocratic? Yes. But should we just take a hands-off, laissez-faire attitude when faced with this situation? There is a real impact, as it can deprive our young of the opportunities they need to learn on the job and to progress to more senior positions later on. I don't think we can just ignore the situation. So what do we do? Before I talk about solutions, let me state clearly our guiding philosophy and thinking. In everything that we do, as a government, it must benefit our people, both for the present and for the future. What do we want to achieve? We want good jobs, wages, and opportunities for our people. We want a system that is fair, and we want to be able to develop and nurture the talents and abilities of a Singaporean core to the fullest potential. In this respect, we know that by being open, by being competitive, we are able to generate good jobs and opportunities for our people. We remain open to free movement, both of manpower and other resources, because if we are closed off, we'll be worse off. And I think a number of members in this chambers at various occasions have highlighted this, because they are concerned that if you overdo this, it can have a detrimental impact. And I think many Singaporeans understand that, and they're not asking for us to be closed off. They're asking for an appropriate balance. They're asking for fairness. At the same time, and I think it's important to emphasize this, it is only fair and reasonable that foreign firms and foreigners working here bear a responsibility to the local community. In a sense, this is somewhat of a social compact. We do not require global firms to give preferential treatments to locals, but they must be fair to Singaporeans. There must be equal opportunities for our people, whether at hiring or in advancement. There has to be a level playing field. So having articulated the thinking, how do we translate it into something that works? Now, this is a complex issue that I think it cannot just depend on one silver bullet to solve all the problems. So we will take a system approach that will comprise structural as well as process-based adjustments. In essence, this is what we will do. In terms of structure, we will adjust our work pass frameworks. In fact, the changes made to the employment pass framework in January last year was aimed at addressing some of these concerns. What we did was to tier the qualifying salary criteria to account for experience. If you recall, previously it was $2,800, we raised it to $3,000, but it wasn't just an entry level at $3,000. We tiered it at different levels, meaning that if you were to come in at an older age with more experience, you would not qualify for employment pass only at $3,000. It would have to be higher because you need to pay for an appropriate level. And the intent was really to level the playing field so that more experienced foreigners do not undercut our own PMEs. Well, we have seen the numbers at the EP level drop by about 1,600 last year. This is the first time the EP numbers have dropped since 2003. Some have been converted to the S-Pass instead, because a lot of them were clustering actually at about $3,000. But now they'll be subject to DRC ratios and levies. So this formulation, I think, works and it has an impact. And as you are aware, we will now apply this same tiering concept to our S-Pass. But over and above that, I will make further adjustments to the EP framework, especially to the Q1 segment later this year. We are working on the details, but I believe that this, and the purpose of this, is to better help our junior to mid-level PMEs, because the Q1 segment, I think, needs adjustment. Now, in terms of process, we expect all employers doing business in Singapore to comply with the tripartite guidelines on fair employment practices. Now, if there are issues, MOM will step in to investigate, and we will not hesitate to curtail work pass privileges. At the same time, we will also explore a practical, workable process where Singaporeans are given fair opportunity in the hiring process. And we will deepen the efforts with companies to develop a local pipeline for Singaporean talents. And this would be a consideration as companies are brought into Singapore. So it's a combination of structural and process adjustments that we believe in taking a systemic approach towards dealing with this issue. Now, let me explain how these changes will address the three categories of concern that I mentioned earlier. So firstly, the hiring their own kind type of problem. Now, on this issue, we do not, I would say this, we do not and will not tolerate this in Singapore. In fact, there are a number of live cases that MOM is handling presently. And let me use one of them to illustrate. A discriminatory online job advertisement was recently put up. I was tempted to mention the company, but I won't, but it's a very prominent company, saying that it only wanted to recruit people of a certain nationality. I personally went through the advert a few times. I could see no reason why it had to be, why you had to recruit someone of that particular nationality. And this is completely unacceptable. So we informed the company to remove the advertisement immediately, which they have done so. We suspended their work pass privileges. It remains suspended, and we asked to see the senior management. In fact, a few of them flew in from overseas to meet my colleagues. We are setting out clear expectations on the part of the company to address the situation and to make amends. Their work pass privileges will remain suspended until we are satisfied that remedial actions will be taken. In other instances, depending on complaint, nature of alleged discriminatory practices, of which we receive from time to time, TAFEP will investigate, TAFEP will speak to the company, and if they find that there are issues of concern, they will escalate the matter up to MOM. And in the same vein, we may also suspend work pass privileges as we investigate. And this will include interviewing the employees to understand whether, from their perspective, discriminatory practices are taking place. And we will build up a profile of the various companies. What else can we do? Well, sometimes actually it's a matter of the management of companies being more aware and putting in place responsible HR practices. In fact, today, on various occasions, we have talked about how employers should be more responsible. We should have more enlightened HR practices. Well, for example, DPM Tharman and myself have met up with the senior management of a number of financial institutions on a few occasions to stress the point that the financial industry players really should make a more concerted effort to develop a local talent pipeline. Now, these sessions actually have been productive and actually quite useful. And the management, to be quite frank, have been quite honest to reflect that they need to be more mindful of the need to ensure that discriminatory hiring practices are not entrenched in the industry. Some were quite candid. They recognized that they had actually not paid enough attention to how hiring was done and that unhealthy enclaves had been formed. Others acknowledged that they would need to be conscious of diversity and clustering in their own makeup. I would like to acknowledge Mr. Gerald Giam for his comments. We are clearly thinking along the same lines. TAFEP and MOM have been engaging not just the HR managers, but the firm's management to remind them of their obligations to attract and develop Singaporeans on merit. When complaints are lodged against firms, TAFEP engages them and ensure that all those involved in the hiring process, including the line managers, are trained in the methods of fair recruitment and selection. Actually, the response has been positive. But what we will do is to step up on this front, and we will take administrative measures, and we will begin to do so. And we will also begin to build up a profile to understand the various companies. So a lot actually will also depend on complaints and feedback provided by often the employees working in these companies as well. What actually that tells us as well, from a management perspective, is please manage your companies sensibly. A lot of it comes from sensible management, sensible engagement, explaining to people, and actually be conscious about what you're doing. Be conscious about what your various line managers are doing. Because a lot of them are not paying attention to that. Secondly, there's undue haste in the recruitment process. So this second issue is really about taking the shortest route in the recruitment process. And we need to ensure that firms surely must give fair consideration to Singaporeans in their hiring practices. When we received the feedback about how that company went abroad on this massive recruitment exercise, it actually sounds quite appalling. But unfortunately, that's sometimes what happens. And I think when we pointed that out, I think that was, I hope that that registered with that particular company. And certainly I think we will make sure that we note that. So, and we have been studying the work pass frameworks. I think a number of you here have also shared your perspectives. Dr. Yowat Kwang, Dr. Xiaxi Lu, and Engineer Lebiwa have made various suggestions about how we should incorporate the best features and adapt it to our needs. About how employers ought to show proof that they have searched for local candidates by requiring them to advertise job vacancies to locals before a foreigner can be hired. All this sounds reasonable, but actually when we studied the systems, going behind the scenes, talking to the businesses, talking to the government officials, things aren't always what it appears to be on the surface. Our preliminary research indicates that implementing such measures effectively while still providing for employers' genuine need for talent is actually not so straightforward. I just cite two examples. Hong Kong have their GEP, their General Employment Policy, which allows local employers to recruit foreign professionals not readily available in Hong Kong to meet their manpower needs, subject to a set of criteria. But when you look at the data and the application, actually most of the applications put up by employers all end up being approved anyway. In the US, while they do have requirements to ensure US citizens are recruited first before foreigners, but they also take a balanced approach. For the H-1B visa, which is meant for foreign professionals, this requirement does not apply to actually every employer. Instead, it applies only to higher risk employers who hire many H-1B workers or have submitted false applications. And I think with every system, there are pluses, but there are also realities that perhaps would surface when you look at it closer. But I will say this, I think there's a sense that these approaches serve as useful markers, as a signal, even if they do not adequately address the underlying concerns effectively. They may also actually be complicated to design, and that's why I think we are looking at it intently, to study it further, to see how best to come up with a system that would make sense for us. The design of each country's work pass, as you can see, actually differs, and a lot of it due to the different local circumstances. But it's something that we believe we can look at, and something that we will work on adapting a particular system that will make sense for us. I would like to build on an interesting idea floated by Engineer Lebiwa. I don't know why she only talk about E2I. We also have caliber link. So, could we consider perhaps having employers examine caliber link, E2I, pool of PMEs and unemployed Singaporeans looking for jobs? In fact, we're helping companies doing the match. In fact, we're doing that with SMEs as well. Can we enhance that before employment passes are awarded? Or in fact, earlier we talked about the individual learning portfolio, where Dr. Amy Call talked about how we are planning to develop this, how you put on your database, put on your skills. And because it's all IT-based, you can actually weave it in a system where actually that also becomes part of that landscape. So I think there are exciting possibilities. I don't think it necessarily will solve everything, which is why it is one part of a larger solution set. So MOM will consult closely with stakeholders in the coming months to further explore and develop a practical framework that best meets our circumstances and needs. Now, the third issue, which is about more Singaporean PMEs joining the workforce. So this is where we are concerned about people coming in and then substituting Singaporeans, because they are lower cost professionals. They could work longer hours because they're here, and their main purpose really is to earn an income, remit it back home, and eventually go back. So MOM will adjust the eligibility criteria at the employment pass level, and we'll continually review this. As more Singaporeans become tertiary graduates, as we have more PMEs, as we've highlighted, the profile is shifting. We will eventually, come 2030 or so, 2/3 of our workforce will be PMEs. So correspondingly, we also need to manage our employment pass numbers. The employment pass numbers have dropped since we restructured, as I mentioned earlier, the employment pass framework, where we raised and incorporated a tiered series of qualifying salary thresholds. So what we are going to do is to also transit this and establish this same structure for the S-Pass. And given the larger proportion of Singaporeans who enter the workforce As PMEs in the near future, we will make adjustments, as I mentioned earlier, to the employment pass framework, particularly the Q1 sector. So this, and the intent is to level the playing field for junior to mid-level PMEs. Our adjustments at the S-Pass framework level, in particular, I think will help our polytechnic graduates. Now, we will not pursue an approach that requires companies to choose a Singaporean regardless of merit. But what we do need is to ensure that companies are fair in assessing all potential candidates for jobs, and both to deter and punish any form of discriminatory or biased decision-making on the part of individuals. This is only fair because we provide a safe, pro-business environment, and companies must surely provide a level playing field for all prospective recruits and employees. The companies here, both local and foreign, have an important role to play as an environment where we nurture Singaporeans' capabilities and to enable their professional growth. We are investing heavily on education and continual training. So tap on this. It is our competitive advantage. As an example, MTI MOE launched a Singapore Industry Scholarship to partner with companies with strong HR practices and who believe in growing their talent. Enlightened CEOs must aim to grow the Singaporeans in their firm. The government has a responsibility to Singaporeans, and businesses have a responsibility to the community where they are located in. This, in some sense, is a virtuous cycle of trust. This social compact should be developed and should be strengthened going forward. As we refine our approach, we must bear in mind that there is no foolproof way to eliminate bias. We will require a combination of different measures, including making our existing work pass framework more robust and relying on whistleblowers within companies to obtain evidence and report discriminatory employment practices. Above all, we must set clear social norms and take a systems approach to ensure that Singaporeans are given fair consideration at our workplaces. Now, moving on to some of the other cuts. Mr. Christopher D'Souza and Mr. Teo Seong Seng asked how the wage credit scheme announced by DPM in his budget statement ties in with our productivity schemes to move Singaporeans into better jobs and better wages. Mr. Heng Chee Hao also raised the issue of whether the wage credit scheme would really raise the wages of workers beyond what the companies would have offered in the first place. Well, my sense is this. Actually, many businesses, including SMEs, will, in all likelihood, have to raise wages given the tight labour market we're in. Demand is very strong, supply is tight. Productivity, however, may not go up as quickly, and I think we acknowledge that. It will take some time. And it may not go up as quickly as a pressure to increase wages. So in such situations, I think we do not want companies to hold wage increases back or to pass on wage increases to consumers simply by increasing prices. So the wage credit scheme was designed and intended to help businesses avoid doing either. Providing companies with an interim buffer so that they can better manage rising wage costs over this period of economic restructuring would also allow them to free up resources to invest in and to focus on actually improving productivity. Rather than half the time worrying about managing their bottom lines and all that, having this assistance managing costs, I think would help companies because they will feel the pressure to raise wages. And it is only with productivity improvements that companies will be able to continue paying high wages in the long run. Mr. Heng also suggested that the National Wage Council include in this year's guidelines a reminder to companies to take the wage credit scheme into account when contemplating wage increases. So in the coming months, the government will be working closely with the unions and employer groups to ensure that the scheme is well understood. We hope that in doing so, more firms will be able to benefit from the significant level of support provided by the scheme. Now let me turn to addressing some of the questions raised on the CPF. Mr. Seng Hon Tong has asked for an update on CPF Life. Now, well, we expect about 34,000 members, or slightly more than half of those turning 55 this year, to be automatically included into CPF Life. It is a little early to tell whether members prefer the standard or basic plan, as they are given 6 months to choose their plan. It is similarly a little too early to work out what their actual payout levels will be. But we know that the median retirement account balance for active members turning 55 in 2013 is projected to be about $90,000. This would correspond to a payout of about $800 for a male member on the standard plan or $700 payout for females. Mr. Singh also asked how we are reaching out to older members. About 83,000 older members have actually already joined CPF Life since the scheme was made available to them on an opt-in basis in 2009. This is already equivalent to and possibly more than the total number of private annuities actually in force today. So the numbers are not bad. But we do need to reach out as expressed by Mr. Singh, and so through various channels we will continue our efforts to raise awareness among older members and their children that CPF Life is an option that they may wish to consider. Mr. Singh also asked about what more could be done to help self-employed persons or SEPs save up for their own healthcare and retirement needs. The enhancements to the WIS announced at Budget 2013 benefit self-employed personnel too. The maximum WIS payouts for low-income SEPs will be increased by 25% to 50%, just like for employees. We will also be giving 10% of WIS payouts to SEPs in cash, instead of paying it entirely into the Medisave accounts. The larger WIS quantum, together with the increase in Medisave contribution rates for low-income SEPs, will give SEPs more cash in hand for their daily expenses while boosting their long-term healthcare adequacy. Mr. Loh Tia Kiang asked whether we could adjust the minimum sum yearly by some more reasonable rate that is not only based on the CPI. It is important that the minimum sum preserves its value so that basic retirement needs for each successive cohort can be met and will not be eroded with inflation. Hence, we will not be able to completely delink MS increases from inflation. Mr. Loh suggested excluding imputed rental and private road transportation from the inflation measure used. In other words, just focus on core inflation, which, as he shared, does not affect the elderly as much. And indeed, I think understanding this difference is important. We are always captured by the headline numbers for inflation, but actually looking at core inflation actually is a useful reference point. I would suggest that not just elderly, but actually for a number of Singaporeans, the core inflation is really the figure that matters. But we did consider how to moderate, when we were considering how to moderate the MS increase last year, we actually explored using core inflation to adjust the minimum sum instead. So we actually studied the historical trends and actually found that headline inflation and core inflation rates actually did not differ significantly for actually much of the past decade. In fact, in some years, core inflation was actually higher than headline inflation. So this is why we decided to stick to using headline inflation, but to moderate the increase in the minimum sum by spreading out the remaining real minimum sum increases to reach the target minimum sum in 2015 instead of 2013. Several MPs touched upon various rules concerning the use of CPF for housing. Mr. Loh Tia Kiang asked for a review of the valuation limit of VL policy. The VL aims to prevent excessive use of CPF savings for housing. As Mr. Loh has described, members who reach a VL may face difficulties in financing their homes. In fact, I have faced the same situation myself, not for myself, but for my residents who have come to see me. Mr. Yee Jian-jong and Mr. Gan Tian Po raised this in Parliament actually last year as well. Several other MPs, including Engineer Lee Biwa and Mr. Masagos Zulkifli, had also approached MOM directly to actually ask for a review. And therefore, we are actually starting a review of the VL policy. Meanwhile, on a case-by-case basis, we have allowed members some flexibility to use CPF beyond VL where the case merits. But the review is underway, and when ready, we will announce the outcome of it. Ms. Li Lian asked that members be allowed to use their retirement account savings to pay outstanding housing loans. Today, members can already use the part of their RA which is above half of their minimum sum for housing. And on a case-by-case basis, we have granted concessions for needy elderly members to tap on even more RA savings for their housing needs. Ms. Lee mentioned about a particular case. We have checked, and with regards to that particular member, we actually did not reject. We're actually in the process of asking the individual to provide us more information to evaluate whether his case could be warrants merit. Madam Chair, I will now briefly address other concerns raised by MPs on better protection for our workers, an issue which I actually covered earlier in my first speech. Mr. Seng Han Tong asked about better protection for self-employed Singaporeans, and indeed this is something that we are concerned about, and we will address it in Phase 2 of the Employment Act review, because as mentioned, it is a complex landscape. We recognize, however, that there may be workers who are engaged as freelancers or self-employed persons when the relationship is really one of employer-employee. As a result, these workers actually do not enjoy protection as an employee under our labour laws. So it's important for us to look at this under the Phase 2 of the Employment Act review. So we will continue to raise awareness of compliance with the Employment Act and CPF Act under the Work Right campaign to ensure that the employment rights of such workers are protected. And I do ask members of this House to support that campaign, because as a result of greater awareness, we have found that people are stepping forward. And I think particularly low-wage Singaporeans and Singaporeans perhaps with lower education may not be familiar with their rights, and it's important for their rights to be respected and to be enforced. Mr. Yeo Guat Kwong suggested better protection of our foreign workers. Well, I would like to stress that actually the Employment Act is nationality blind. The enhancements to the EA apply both to local and to foreign workers. As you are aware, we have also made changes to the Employment of Foreign Manpower Act, or the EFMA, last year. And we will be doing more to protect workers in Phase 2, actually of both the Employment Act and the Employment of Foreign Manpower Act reviews, with a view to achieve equitable balance of rights and responsibilities between employers and workers. Mr. Zainal Sapari also asked what the ministry can do to make it easier for workers to make claims for non-payment of salaries. And we will be reviewing penalties for salary non-payout as part of the EA review to send a clear signal that employers must not fail to pay their workers' salaries in the first place. And I fully share Mr. Sapari's concern for some of these workers. Any delay actually has a major impact on the quality of life of these Singaporeans. Our plans to make it mandatory for employers to provide pay slips, as suggested by Mr. Yeo, will also help in facilitating the resolution of such pay disputes. I would like to assure everyone again that MOM is committed to improving our processes, including through our EFMA and EA reviews, to ensure that the employment rights of all workers are protected. Lastly, I would like to emphasize on the continued importance of strong tripartite cooperation in our current landscape. Now, strong tripartite cooperation has always been a hallmark of Singapore. It's something that I've come to realize. Perhaps I didn't pay much attention to it previously, but it is something actually quite unique. And increasingly, many countries actually view this quite positively. They find it fascinating that we are able to establish something like that. And I think it's something that we should not take for granted, and we should strengthen it. It has contributed to general industrial harmony, stable jobs for our workers, and in turn our attractiveness as a business and investment location, which ultimately benefits Singaporeans. Assistant Professor Eugene Tan is right when he pointed out that the SMRT strike in December last year is a reminder that we cannot take tripartism for granted. Assistant Professor Tan asked whether legislation could be introduced to enable sanctions against any employer which treats their employees poorly. Well, the Employment Act already stipulates basic employment standards. The government's role is to ensure that these basic employment standards are upheld. But I think we would all agree that it is difficult, it's perhaps not even possible or desirable that we use regulations and the law to prescribe management practices. I fully recognize, and like I mentioned earlier, in this House today, we have talked about enlightened management, positive management, how do you engage, how do you have good communications with your staff. Do you mandate that? Do you legislate that? Companies really need to level up and understand that it is a fundamental requirement of building any great organizations. So disputes actually occur fairly frequently. We see the cases. Some of it are we aren't able to proceed because it's a dispute between employer and employee, which is why we are establishing another setup to deal with this, non-statutory violations. And frankly, the first avenue in resolving these disputes must surely come from within the companies, rather than straight away running to regulations and laws. While legal strikes are a legitimate course of action for unions to negotiate for pay and other benefits, I think we must continue to make sure that that is a last resort, and that there are adequate avenues for consultation, negotiation, and dispute conciliation, so workers need not resort only to industrial action. Also, we need to ensure that our unions remain relevant. Assistant Professor Tan suggested that the government consider requiring companies to pay the union subscriptions, especially of their foreign employees. Union membership should be driven by unions, who would then be motivated to offer attractive services to their members to stay relevant. We understand that there are companies, for example, Resorts World Sentosa, that do pay for union membership on behalf of all their rank and file members as fringe benefits. And unions can negotiate for this for their workers. In the wake of the SMRT strike, the National Transport Workers Union has been reaching out to SMRT employees. I understand that it has been successful in recruiting more union members, many of whom are foreign workers. I also understand that NTUC has set itself the ambitious goal of being 1 million strong by 2015 and is actively innovating to reach out to more workers, including by setting up social enterprises that provide a wide range of benefits for union members. So given the very strong commitment by our tripartite partners, I'm convinced and confident that we will be able to reinforce the relationship and the foundation that we built up over the years. And by doing so, I think we will equip ourselves to continue to handle new challenges that invariably will happen in our changing landscape and workplace norms. And this is where it's important to highlight that companies do play a very important part. It is not just about unions, it's not just about workers, but employers play a critical role in this. In conclusion, Madam Chair, my ministry, along with the whole of government, is committed to making things better for all Singaporeans. On our part, we will do what we can to create better jobs, wages, opportunities for our people. Because this, like I mentioned earlier, allows us to have a stable base upon which individuals can reach out and meet their various aspirations. We also aim to develop better workplaces where people can find work-life meaningful. Can we and our children look to the future with hope? Will our policies be able to touch the lives of our people meaningfully? Would we still be proud to call Singapore home? Well, I believe so. But it can only happen if we all walk this journey together. Government, our people, businesses. We can't just straight away, when there are issues, when there are concerns, turn and expect governments, where the handouts, where the incentives, where the regulations. I think we all have a part to play. Because no solution can just come from government alone. As you can see, many of these requires a mindset shift. Can you mandate a mindset shift? Can you legislate for that? Sometimes it would be counterproductive. And this is where it's important for us to build up mutual trust and respect. And this has to be earned, not just by what we say, by what we do on all fronts. This budget is just one step amongst many towards building a better Singapore for all Singaporeans. Thank you.